Hey everybody, this is Eric, and I'm going to talk to you about how you can use the motion graph in Moho or Anime Studio to do a ball bounce, and I'm hoping this will teach you a lot about using the motion graph. And also, the ball bounce is a fundamental of animation. All animation students start out with a ball bounce, and they get sick of ball bounces, but they are incredibly important to learn. So I'm begging you, just do a simple ball bounce. So many people say, oh, I'm going to get clever. I'm going to turn the ball into something else, a little character, or I'm going to do all kinds of weird spins, or I'm going to have all kinds of action. Please don't. Learn the ball bounce. It is a fundamental. Okay, what we're looking at here is kind of a diagram of a ball bounce. And you'll notice it starts at a high point, then it drops down, hits the ground, squashes when it hits the ground, then bounces back up and keeps bouncing. Now, we're not going to bounce across the screen in this example. We're going to bounce up and down in place, but that's harder to draw for you to see here. Now, what I want you to notice is between the start and it hitting the ground, starts on frame 1, ends on frame 7 with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frames in between. And those frames get further and further apart as you go down. Now, the closer an object is on the frames, on each successive frame, the slower it appears to move. And the further apart it is, the faster it appears to move. And so what happens in a ball bounce is when the ball reaches the top of the arc, gravity gets it, starts slowing it down, then it slowly starts dropping and hits the ground, scrunches down, and immediately pops back up, which is a faster action. The ball doesn't have a clue when it's going to hit the ground. So it just speeds up as it falls, and when it hits the ground, it just pops right back up. But I've seen people have the ball slow down right before it hits the ground. It's a ball. It can't see the ground. It doesn't know the ground's coming. It's a surprise. So that's what's happening here. Okay, so there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frames in between the start and the land. To go back up, I've only done 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not going as far, so it doesn't take quite as long to get back up, and then it's another 1, 2, 3, 4 before it hits the ground again, and then it doesn't have as far to travel, so now it's only 3 between, 17 to 21, and then 3 between to hit the ground again, and that's where we'll stop. So let's go over to Moho, which I'll call it from now on. This will also work in Moho and Anime Studio, and do a bouncing ball, and then make it good or better by using the motion graph. Okay, so we'll start. First step, make the ball. I'm going to choose a green color because the balls can be red or blue, depending. The bones can be red or blue, depending on whether they're selected. So let's just choose a color that doesn't, that won't blend in with the bone too much. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and right near the top, I'm going to just draw out a circle about that big. The reason I held down the Shift key is that forces that circle to be perfectly round. You'll also notice these 2 red boxes inside my stage. What I've done is I've gone into the View menu and I've turned on Video Safe Zones. The outer box is the box you should keep all your major action in your film within. And the inner box is where you should keep all the type that needs to be read. I see people walking their characters across the very bottom of the stage. That's a real amateur mistake. I won't get into any more of that. There's our ball. And what we're going to do is use this inner red box as a guide for the ground. We're just going to bounce the ball off of that bottom red line. It won't show up in your movie, but it gives us something to aim for and to keep the bounce consistent. Okay, so there's our ball. I'm going to set the origin of the ball layer to the bottom center of the ball. That way when it hits the ground and squashes, it will squash with that bottom staying in place. And we're also going to build the bone that way. This is just a safety mechanism. Okay, so there's the ball. I'm going to create a bone layer now. And I'm going to drag the ball layer into it. And then I'm going back to my bone layer, get the Add Bone tool. Just going to click and drag a bone that starts at the bottom and ends at the top of the ball like that. And I'm going to get my bone strength tool and turn it all the way off. You know it's all the way off when at the top right you see the bone strength. It should say 0. Sometimes you don't drag it hard enough and get a little left over. So I'll go back to my ball layer. In the bone section of the tools menu, I'll get the bind layer tool, and I will just click on that bone. You can see that bone gets really heavily highlighted. That shows that that layer is bound to that bone. So now I'm just going to close the bone layer because we're not going to touch that ball again. Everything else is just going to be done with the bone. So, as you remember, on frame 1, we're going to start with the highest point of the entire bounce. And instead of going across like this, we're just going to go up and down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to frame 1. I'm going to go to the bone menu, and I'm just going to say freeze pose. And that creates, if you'll see in the timeline, that has created keyframes. In this case, for the bone translation, rotation, that's the angle. For the translation, which is a fancy word for saying move, and for the scale, which is another way we're going to be doing when we use the squash. That'll come up later. But let's go ahead and prepare for that. This can be done anywhere in the timeline. I'm just going to make sure that bone is selected. I've got the just standard select bone tool selected. You can hit the B key on your keyboard. And with that, I click this bone constraints drop down. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to turn on squash and stretch scaling and leave it at 1. That way when I squash that bone, it will squash the ball evenly so it keeps the same volume rather than getting smaller. So when I squash the bone down, the sides will puff out. You'll see that. And the other thing I want to do is we're not going to ever rotate this bone. Let's not even do it by accident. I'm going to turn on angle constraints, and I'm going to set both to 0. Now, whatever I do, I cannot rotate that bone. So I'll show you that again. See, no matter what I do, I'm going to do this entire thing using the transform bone tool now. I'm going to ignore the manipulate bones tool and stick with the transform bones tools. You see, I can't rotate it because of that angle constraint. And the other thing is when I squash the ball up and down, see, it kind of keeps the same volume. So let me just undo that. So that's all going to get used. So we're starting, we set the keyframes for frame 1. So that's all we needed to do there. And then it's going to hit the ground on frame 7 according to our diagram right down here. So I'm going to just, with my transform bone tool selected, there's 2 ways I can move this bone. One is just to put my mouse directly over this lower circle at the base of the bone, and you'll see the 4-pointed arrow appear, and you can drag. I'll undo that. Or you can hold down your Option key or your Alt key on your keyboard. It's the same key, depending on what system you're on. With that held down, the 4-pointed arrow appears whenever you're over the bone, and you can still move it around, but you don't have to aim for the target. Undo that. The other thing we're going to do when we move the bone is hold down the Shift key so it keeps things in a straight line. With the Shift key held down and the Option key held down, see how it's on. Oops, you can actually pull too hard and get it off to the side, but see when I do that, if I move, it'll snap right back. And so that's forcing it, if you're careful, in a totally straight up and down line. So let me undo that. Back where we started. So I'll go to frame 7 because that's when it hits the ground, as we saw. Hold down Shift, hold down Option, straight down till it hits that line because that's our pretend ground. There. I'm not going to squash it at this point. I am going to get to that later. Let's just get the bounce going for now. Now our next thing is on frame 12. It's at the highest point of the bounce that follows. So let's go back. I'm going to go to come out to frame 12. And I'm going to just move that up about halfway. Again, Shift, Option. Move it up about halfway along the bounce. And we're going to use the motion graph to really make sure that things are lined up. So I'm just going to get close right now. So there's a bounce. It's kind of a dull bounce, but it's a bounce. And now I'm going to go back. It hits the ground next at 17. So let's go out to frame 17. Shift Option, hit the ground. Then it rises up again, and it's at its next bounce high point at 21. So I'll go to frame 21. Shift Option, again about halfway in between. And then it hits the ground again at 25, and we're going to end this demonstration bounce there. You can add a few more smaller bounces for it to really come to a rest. So let's go back, and so that is frame 25, Shift and Option, and that's where we're going to end. So let me just go ahead and set this to only go to, say, 30 at the end. And I'll hit play. There's our basic bounce. All right, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually have the squash only happen when it hits the ground. Some cartoonists will have the ball start to stretch out right before it hits the ground because that gives a nice cartoonier feel. We're not going to worry about that right now. We're going to actually simply set a keyframe for the bone scale 1 frame before it hits the ground. And so just on my key scale, on my bone scale line, I'll just double click. That creates a keyframe. And then I'll come to the next one. I'll grab, and I'm going to go just drag sideways. If you drag sideways, it stretches out. If you drag up, if you drag left, I should say, it squashes down. If you drag right, it goes up. So we're just going to squash that sucker down there. So you'll notice by setting the keyframe, bang, that's where it hits the ground. And then on the way up, it should go back out, but it doesn't because we haven't set a keyframe for it going back to normal. So let's just say that about halfway to the top of the next bounce, 1, 2, 3 frames out or so, it should be back to normal. 2 ways to get that back to normal. One, at the very top of the thing, you can see the scale figure, which for me is 0.6433. I can just change that back to 1. Pops back to a round ball. Or I'll undo that. I can also just go to a point where it's at 1, select the keyframe, copy it, and paste it. I do both depending on what I'm working on. So let's go bounce up. Go to the next place where it hits the ground, and right before it hits the ground, again, we're just going to double click on that bone scale line to freeze it. We're going to then drag to the left to squash it, but not quite as much as last time because it's not hitting as hard. And I'll go out 1, 2, 3, and I'm just going to come back up to scale and change that back to 1. And for that last land, let's just squash it a tiny bit. So I'm going to, right before it lands, I'm going to double click there to add that keyframe. And then I'm going to go here and just give it a teeny tiny squash. And just to make it finish out normal, I'll go 1, 2, 3, and set the scale back to 1. Okay, so we've got a okay ball bounce. But this is where we learn the motion graph. So what I'm going to do is click on the motion graph tab in the timeline. I'll go back to frame 1 here. And then I'm going to double click on the selected bone translation icon at the far left of the timeline. And that will show me, I'm also going to make that bigger so we can see it better. That will show me the motion graph for that particular tool, for the bone translation, for the bone move. And you'll notice that green line is up and down. That's the y-axis, or up and down. And you can see the bounce. Boing, boing, boing. And it gets about halfway each time. The red line is left to right or right to left. That's your x-axis. You'll notice it's perfectly straight. That's exactly what we want for this, because we don't want the ball moving left or right. Now let me show you again. I may have done this too well. I'm going to just draw straight. Oh, let me undo that. I'm going to try and draw straight. See, it's a pretty straight line through, but let's draw so that it touches one more time. There we go. That's a pretty straight line from the start to the finish. And you'll notice that the two middle ones are both a little bit high. They're not wrong. It's never perfectly. But let's go ahead and we'll move the first bounce down a little and the second bounce there down a little more. And that'll be a little bit more accurate. This doesn't have to be perfect. So all I have to do is take my mouse and click on that keyframe. I'm going to hold down the shift key again because that prevents it from jumping from frame to frame. Bring it down just a touch. And I'm going to bring this, undo, deselect. I'll hold down the shift, click, and bring that down a little more. And that's a fairly straight line between that. It's not a bad bounce, but let's make it better. And this is where the Bezier interpolation comes in. Now, you may not realize that there are different ways to go between the keyframes in Moho, but it's set to smooth by default, and that's usually pretty good. But with Bezier, we can get a ton of control. So let me just select, click and drag to select all the keyframes. I'm just going to right click over top of one of the keyframes. And that's not going to show you the drop down. Let me see if I can come up here. Right click on that. There it is. And I'm going to just go down this list and choose Bezier. Click. Now you're seeing all the handles. And they're very like the Bezier curves that have been added to the shape tools in Moho. And let's get more of a slow in and out at the high points and maybe sharpen up the speed of the bounce at the bottom. Now you can just click and drag on these handles. Takes a tiny bit of practice, but you'll get it. So I'll start with this first handle on keyframe 1, and if I drag it up, I get a bit more of a rounded curve at the top. That slows things down just a little bit as it goes down and speeds it up as it hits, because it's at a kind of jagged, it's a sharp point at the bottom. I'm actually going to sharpen that point by bringing these in. I'll come out to this one, and I'm going to smooth that out a little more. When they become even, it becomes this little seesaw. If you want to break those, you just hold down the Control key and grab on one. Click on the Option key, the Alt key, and drag on one, and it breaks them so that they can be independent. But I actually want them pretty smooth on the top. I'll sharpen up this hit. I'll smooth this last one out. I'll sharpen up that. See how much better that bounce is? It has a lot more feel to it. And that is how you use the motion graph. We can also just go back and let's double click on the scale, selected bone scale. And I can actually, that's where I hit it. The next one along is where it squashes, and 1, 2, 3 is when it goes back to normal. So I'm just, again, going to select the points I'm going to be working with. I can miss that first one because it doesn't have any action. I'll put my mouse right over any of the keyframes, right click, choose Bezier. Now again, it's going to be pretty straight until it hits. So I can then just grab, but let's make it go a little slow in and out on the way up. So I'll just bring this out a little bit, and I'll bring this one up a little bit. And that gives us a little bit of slow in and out. I'll do the same. Oops, I want to leave those straight because that is right before. Go forward one. This one. Stretch it out, slow it in. Leave that one alone, keep that one straight. Stretch it out. Slow it in. And that is a pretty decent ball bounce. So I recommend that you practice these, because you'll find that other things that bounce, like the hips on a walk, are very much like a ball bounce. In fact, the walk for the hip bone for a walk will look a lot like that, although it might be more of an even up and down, but it will look a lot like that. So learning this and really understanding it and playing with the Bezier will help you a lot. Anyway, you can ask questions in the comments, and I hope you found this useful.